Great. Greetings, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started now. A very warm welcome to you all to this webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. My name is Kira Clark-Wolf, and I'm co-hosting this webinar with my colleague, Imtiaz Ringwala. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate and other environmental changes, with a focus on the North Central U.S. that encompasses the Missouri and Upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speakers, a quick note on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will be able to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A. We will end the formal part of this webinar at noon Mountain Time and stop the recording at that point. After that, anyone who wishes to stay on to engage in a more informal conversation with our speakers is encouraged to do so. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today, Toby Maxwell and Chelsea Nagy. Toby Maxwell is an ecosystem ecologist and research scientist based in Bend, Oregon, and holds appointments at both Boise State University and Oregon State University. Toby's research is focused on understanding carbon and nitrogen cycling and how they affect and are affected by management, climate, and disturbances in dryland and rangeland ecosystems, with a focus on breaking the invasive grass fire cycle. Toby's research spans the arid and semi-arid Western U.S., covering 7 states where he has worked with city, county, state, federal, private, and nonprofit land managers with a focus on co-production of research as he seeks to generate actionable science that can expand opportunities to improve rangeland soil health. Toby has a PhD from the University of California, Davis in agricultural and environmental chemistry. Chelsea Nagy is an ecosystem ecologist and research scientist at the University of Colorado Boulder. She is the Deputy Director for EASL, an NSF-funded synthesis center where she leads strategic science initiatives, builds partnerships, and oversees planning and coordination for key programs and events. She studies drivers of global change, such as land use change and climate change, and consequences for ecosystem structure, function, and composition. Her current research explores the role of grass invasion and wildfire on ecological transformations and the impacts on carbon storage in the North Central U.S. Chelsea is the founder of the North Central Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. Chelsea has a PhD from Brown University in ecology and evolutionary biology. The title of today's webinar is Exploring the Carbon Effects of Forest Transformation and Exotic Annual Grassland Restoration in the North Central U.S. Thank you so much to both of our speakers for being here today, and I'll pass it over to Toby.
All right, well, thanks for the introduction. Can you hear me all right? Sweet. All right, so we're going to split this in two, as you might guess. And so I'm going to start off with this first portion on restoration in exotic annual grasslands. So before I start, I want to take a moment and thank the many, many people that make this research possible. So on my title slide, I didn't acknowledge USGS, and that's just simply because some of this is late-breaking preliminary data, and we couldn't go through the review process. But there's been many hands lifting up this type of work for almost 10 years, leading to this really impressive effort. You can see here some folks sampling one of 21 sites that we went to in an afternoon. And there's a massive effort by many technicians as well as project leads, and that you can see banked up here. And then in the bottom, none of this work would have been possible without many, many very gracious managers who went to the field with me, gave their time, and from all sorts of different levels, from city all the way up to federal level. So I just want to start with that gratitude, especially because of the challenges that all sorts of folks are facing with this type of work. So now to jump in, I want to start by just kind of asking why carbon in drylands. And so here you can see a map of the sagebrush domain where my work is focused. And This is covering hundreds of millions of acres across the Western U.S. and Canada. And these soils are far from saturated in carbon. And so this means that there's a potential for these low productivity systems to have a small changes make a big difference in their carbon storage. And these are large landscapes managed by relatively few entities. So there's a great opportunity to work with smaller number of people to affect large areas. Carbon is also interesting in drylands because these are water limited systems in many cases. And so carbon isn't just about solving the greenhouse gas problem that we have, but it's also a part of a core ecosystem function, and it relates to many co-benefits. So you can see in this graphic here, a soil quality improvement of improving soil surface carbon over time can have effects on soil structure, through its aggregation, which affects infiltration, nutrient and water holding capacity, productivity or forage production, and also restoration success and resilience. So my interest here comes from thinking about how large scale landscape scale disturbances are affecting carbon on the landscape. And possibly the largest in the Western US is the annual grass fire cycle, with 1 million acres additionally a year being affected by this process. And so you see here in this cartoon a native ecosystem undergoing fire, which selects for grasses, but these annual grasses that are non-native have a higher fire frequency, and the native plants aren't adapted and thus can't really regrow and compete. And so we have this reinforcing cycle. That's not just in the shrublands, but also while there is greater resilience of the native perennial grasslands of these systems, there still is a lot of large-scale takeover of those grasslands with transitioning them from perennial to annual. So just looking at these different community types that I've showed you, we would think that soil carbon in particular should be affected by the perennial to annual transition. So of course there's a shift in biomass, but the below ground portion of this ecosystem is also undergoing a substantial shift from deep rooted and tap rooted native system to a shallow rooted annual. And we're particularly interested in soil carbon, not just because it may be changing, but because in these semi-arid areas, the soils can contain, depending on the plant community and disturbance history, somewhere between 10 and 70 times as much carbon as there is above ground. So this theoretically stable reservoir of carbon is something that could be being affected by this grass fire cycle. And so we thought that this deserved more study. So there was a review put out by Chelsea, who will follow me up, in 2021, and then myself and my colleague Matt Germino reworked their data to look at it in some new ways as well. And this review sought to look at all of the different measurements in the literature that had been made of carbon in the different ecosystems of the Great Basin. And so this was simplified down to native sagebrush, invaded sagebrush, and cheatgrass ecosystems. I don't want to belabor this plot too much, but you can see here on the right-hand side a surface and a deeper soil plot where there's carbon on the x-axis and time since a wildfire had occurred on the x-axis, sort of as a proxy for time since potential conversion to annual grassland. And what you'll see is across all these different points, there wasn't as much difference between the different community types in terms of their soil carbon as might be expected. And in particular, in the deep soils, this wasn't the case. And so this led to sort of this question of, is there a need for a revision of theory? So changing in all that root structure and perennial to annual transition wasn't affecting carbon? Or is there potentially an issue with the data? And so we thought, okay, let's go forward and see if we can learn a little bit more about that data set. And what we found was that there wasn't a decent amount of side-by-side comparison of invaded and uninvaded states, and with consideration of other co-occurring factors like wildfire. Additionally, if you look at this map, you can see all the different data points from this study represented across the Western US, and we're coloring them according to their resistance and resilience class. This is a classification used to understand resistance to cheatgrass invasion in particular, and it's based on soil temperature and moisture regimes. And so what we're finding is also that a lot of the literature is coming from these low resistance and resilience areas, meaning that the full effect of these invasions hasn't even been studied in terms of soil carbon. So we thought, okay, let's get out there and look for some funding and do research. And this was actually piloted by NView, we're very grateful to start this research with their help. And so we thought, let's overcome some of the limitations of previous work by doing really vigorous study. So we'll look at matching site history of burned and invaded community types, account for microsite heterogeneity. So for example, underneath the canopy of a sagebrush shrub compared to in a bare soil interspace, there's going to be different cycling of moisture and carbon, nitrogen, all sorts of elements, and that's going to affect how much carbon is stored there. And then also some studies had suffered from poor replication or accounting of their sample processing methods, which can really affect the results. So we went in and looked at these 4 different community types to try and see if we could identify a separate burning and an invasion effect. So this led to a recent publication in Communications Earth Environment, and the title here kind of says it all, that annual grass invasions are depleting ecosystem carbon storage by about 50%. So I'll just show you one slide here, which is the main result. From this transition from the native state, whether it was invasion, burning, or burning and invasion, we saw, as you can see on the right-hand side, each one of those transitions was leading to a near 50% reduction in carbon stock. So we wanted to dig a little deeper because many people who are invested in the carbon world understand that not all carbon is created equal. So we wanted to see if these degradations of carbon that were occurring might actually be also affecting different forms of carbon in the soil. And so if you split carbon at the highest level, commonly we think of organic versus inorganic carbon. Inorganic would be like carbonates, organic would just be decomposed plant material in most cases. And this organic portion can be split into particulate or mineral associated forms. Just at a very high level, we can think of that particulate as young, kind of easily decomposed carbon, and the mineral associated as more old and bound up carbon. And so I'm going to take you through the results of a recently published study by my colleague Sydney Katz in coordination also with Mariana de Graaf at Boise State University. And so I'm just going to do this kind of schematically. So the first main result here is that there's a few different pathways that can occur when you have an invasion affecting a shrubland. In this case, we took a subset of our sites because of the more detailed and time-consuming nature of this analysis. So in some sites, we saw carbon increased. But when you look at these different fractions of carbon, you see that that increase was attributed to this POC, that particulate or unstable form of carbon. So even though it looks stable, it looks like there's a carbon increase, it may be somewhat ephemeral. A second pathway is we see no change. And so some sites had that, but when we look at these differences in carbon, in these fractions of carbon, we saw that there was actually a decrease in that mineral associated stable carbon and an increase in that particulate carbon. So there's an offset here, which at the surface level looks like there's no effect, but there's actually a significant effect here because these invasions that we were measuring were only about 20 to 30 years old. And this mineral associated carbon is generally thought to be sometimes thousands of years old. So 20 years could reverse that long-term stabilization. Now, in the last case here, we saw some sites where there was a reduction in carbon, and that reduction could be attributed to losses in mineral associated organic carbon, that stable form. Okay, so I want to take a second and breathe and think, okay, I'm not interested in doom and gloom in terms of thinking about how to manage and understand this ecosystem, but it's a beautiful, resilient ecosystem with many caretakers of it. And so we thought to ask, okay, given this reduction in carbon that we're observing with these invasions, is there a potential to actually return some of that carbon to the system with restoration? And the scale of restoration is also important to consider. look at this map from Pilliod in 2017, you see the scale of restoration across the Great Basin is at the scale of millions of acres, and they're being treated. In many cases, these treatments are targeting exotic annual grasses. So this isn't just about, we can think of this as not just about understanding effects on carbon in this ecosystem, but we can start to learn something about the potential to target restoration for carbon. So this brought us to the NC CASC, where you can see some of our sites mapped out for this study. So we went to them and said, hey, we'd love it if you would help us with funding to ask this question of, is there a carbon benefit of restoration in these exotic annual grass invaded systems? And so you can see here, those first studies were occurring where those blue stars are across the Western U.S. And the CASC study naturally focused on some North Central states, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, where the cheatgrass invasions are hitting the landscape hardest. And so we were able to look at 21 sites across 7 regions or sort of locales across these 3 states. And in this case, most of the restoration was herbicide. So that's a mazipic or rejuvra. There were several drill seeds measured. Restorations range from 3 to 29 years since restoration when we made our measurements. This covered shrublands and grasslands, burned and unburned sites, almost 5,000 feet of elevation gradient, 8 degrees of latitude, and over 10 degrees of mean annual temperature. So we had a pretty large range of geographic conditions and time since restoration, allowing us to really isolate the effect of that restoration. And so we went out and measured plant community composition, microsite variation in soils, and how the plant community was interacting with that, and also measured some of these key co-benefits that I've been talking about: water infiltration and water holding capacity of the soils in several different plant community types. So what did this look like? So we focused on trying to identify the carbon benefit of restoration. So you can see these different invaded states that we were targeting, and we compared those to the restored state. So after some kind of treatment was applied, but also worked really hard to find these never invaded reference plant communities so that we could compare to the baseline for that ecosystem. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few preliminary plots here, comparing responses of invasion and restoration compared to the reference plant community. So these data are presented on a log scale, and I don't want to go too much into the details, but the important thing here is that if you can see in this red to green shaded plot, that a value of 0 on this scale is going to imply that either a restored or invaded point that you see on one of the plots that I'll show you in a minute, that level of 0 means that there's no difference compared to that reference community. Green would be more compared to the reference, and red would be less. Okay, so just want to start off with a big picture. This is a modeled result, and what we see here is a very simple statement. Invasion degraded carbon, we see in the red on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the restoration response across all sites, controlling for a number of those landscape variables, was able to bring carbon in the soil back to the level or statistically kind of comparable to that reference state. But we know that this is complex. And so if we look at the regional level, we can see some of these different regions that we sampled, we have a number of replicates in. And so we're able to see, wow, okay, sometimes the actual invasion and restored sites have greater carbon than that reference state at that 0 level. Sometimes they have less. Also, occasionally you see cheatgrass invasion increasing carbon compared to the restoration response. And so this means that there's some complexity to this. And so we wanted to do a modeling exercise so that we could start to see some of the things that might be driving these variable responses across the landscape. So I'll go into a few of those now. Okay, so first here, we're going to look at the exotic annual grass cover of the invaded state as a way of understanding the carbon response. So if we think about this as you show up at a site, you see how much annual grass cover there is at that site, you might wonder, what's the potential for carbon to be recovered if we restore this site? And you might think that that would simply relate to what you restore it back to. But what this shows is that that the restoration response will actually depend on how invaded the site is. So you can see these two different colors here representing the invaded response in the red and the restoration response in the blue. And what we see is with it first in the red, an increase in exotic annual grass cover, that's simply showing us that more grass cover led to more reductions in carbon. And the restoration response is interesting because that's a reduction in the potential for restoration to increase carbon given the degree of invasion. So that implies that this isn't just about the plant community, but there's alterations occurring to the ecosystem, likely the soil structure and quality, that are actually degrading the potential for restoration over time. Okay, so now looking at another key variable, this region is characterized by large differences in precipitation seasonality. So I wanted to look at how the summer wetness of the system specifically was affecting this carbon response. And so that's key because perennial grasses in these systems are often thought of as one of the keys to resisting these cheatgrass invasions, and they commonly are thought to benefit from this summer precipitation. So ranging from about a quarter to a half of the precipitation at a site coming in during those summer growing months. And what you see here is actually, as you get more and more summer precipitation, this red line, this invasion response, is a much steeper slope and much below zero, indicating that there's a carbon loss as you get conversion to cheatgrass in these more and more summer wet sites. And then we also see this shift in the restoration response, indicating again that across this gradient, there might be some differential effect of that cheatgrass invasion that's degrading the potential for restoration to increase carbon. Okay, now back to the plant community. Similar plot here. We're thinking about, okay, if you want to think about the total productivity of a site. So this is total canopy cover on the x-axis. Note that it goes over 100 because in this case, I was counting, this is line point intercept, and there's multiple ways to do this, but you can count more than one plant covering a particular spot on the ground. So it can have greater than 100% cover. And what we see here is that there's a relationship between the total cover, or essentially the productivity of site, and the invasion response. So more productive sites stand to lose more from invasion. That makes sense. But interestingly, we see that this blue line here, the restoration response, is not really corresponding to how productive a site is, meaning that regardless of the site productivity, there's a potential to restore it to that reference state in terms of carbon. Now, perennial grasses are key to these communities, as I was discussing earlier. So I also wanted to see how the perennial grass cover of that reference community was affecting this carbon response. And so we see with greater perennial grass cover, there's a greater invasion, or a greater closer to reference state carbon in that invaded community. So really what we see here in the headline, dragging things around on the screen, is that communities with more perennial grasses lost less carbon with invasion, but all communities could recover carbon with restoration. So again, we see this restored line as relatively flat and overlapping with zero. Okay, so there's a lot more to come from this study. Not all the data is actually here yet, so we're still working on processing, for example, some of the highest elevation data from Rocky Mountain National Park up near that 9,000 feet. And we also are working on working up a large data set about infiltration and water holding capacity. And so this is key because in this system, at least by my experience, of course, folks care about carbon. They care about the global climate and the changes that are occurring. but the real linchpin is, what does carbon do for these landscapes in terms of management? And so we're really excited to be continuing to work up this data to ask whether restoration can actually return these meaningful soil functions back to the ecosystem. So that's all I've got for you today. I want to again flash this slide just to show my gratitude for all the many different folks that made this work possible across many different bureaucratic levels and many technicians going on long hitches to the middle of nowhere. And so I guess we're going to wait until after Chelsea's talk to take questions, but I just thought I'd put this up briefly to show you some of the publications that I was mentioning, and also to give you my email and thank not only the North Central CASC, but also many other organizations that have helped me in this project, and also in a strange time as a federal employee. I've since moved from the USGS to working with Oregon State. That's been very supportive. So with that, I'll hold off on questions for the end of Chelsea's talk.
Wonderful. Thank you, Toby. Now, quick transition over to Chelsea here.
Okay, how is that looking? Are you seeing?
We're seeing the presenter view.
Sorry, everyone. Hold on, bear with me. First timer here. Still seeing presenter view?
Yes, there should be a way to switch them.
I'm sorry, we did practice this just before jumping on here, everyone. My apologies.
I can chime in with my joke.
Please.
Go for it.
Well, we were discussing beforehand, you know, in the interest of government efficiency, we're packing two into one, but the issue though is you get a minute of transition. So
shoot, I'm really not seeing another way to do this.
There should be at the top something that says display settings, and that's where you would swap presenter view and slideshow, Chelsea.
To spare everyone the time, Kira or Imtiaz, would you be able to share for me? I'm sorry to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me go ahead and pull that up here.
Yeah, sorry if we don't do it that way, you're only going to see the screen like this big.
Okay, let me see. So let's make sure this works. Does that look good?
That looks good to me. Is thumbs up from other folks? Yeah. Okay.
that's great.
Okay, sorry,
Awesome.
Kira, this is a pain in the butt. You're gonna have to advance the slides for me.
No worries at all.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining, and thank you, Kira and Imtiaz, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak to everybody today. Next slide, please. Okay, so I wanted to start off by just giving the 1-minute introduction to the North Central risk. So as Kira mentioned, this is the North Central Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. And the work that we do across this network, the network now has over 160 members from over 60 different organizations across the North Central region and beyond. And so we're really trying to bridge the gap between research and management. And to do this, we synthesize information and conduct new research at the intersection of invasive species and climate change. And so the project that I'll talk about today is funded by the North Central CASC, which provides some guidance for the North Central risk. And this project is conducted by myself and other members of the risk team. Next slide, please. Okay, so invasive plants are a major management concern, and the U.S. has spent about $20 billion a year over the last 10 years on invasive plant management and control. These invasions can exclude native species and change native ecosystems in many ways. A couple common examples of invasive plants are shown here. These include things like purple loosestrife, bufflegrass, salt cedar, and cheatgrass. Next slide, please. So at the same time, global atmospheric CO2 concentrations and temperatures are rising. Precipitation patterns are also changing. And so some areas are experiencing more precipitation while others are experiencing less. And additionally, extreme events are becoming more common. So things like drought, hurricanes, and wildfires. Next slide, please. Wildfire is another management concern which can also have high economic, societal, and environmental consequences. And fire suppression costs have been on the order of $3 billion per year in recent years. And hotter, drier conditions lead to more frequent and larger wildfires. And so we're especially seeing this play out in the Western U.S. in recent decades. Next slide. Okay, so after a fire, or more generally, any kind of disturbance, there could be multiple paths that an ecosystem can go through. And so this figure is showing some of those different paths. So first, one possible outcome is persistence, where a system can withstand these periodic disturbances and be otherwise kind of untransformed by them. The second path is recovery after a perturbation, after some period of time, going through some stage of mortality along the way. The third is transient reorganization. So sometimes recovery takes a long time. And during this time, there can be other ecosystem states. So you can think of this kind of as successional stages that it might go through. And then lastly, there's a chance that an ecosystem will not recover after a fire or other disturbance, but instead it will transform to a different system like a grassland or a shrubland. And so when this is combined with pressure from invasive grasses, the grasses can outcompete the natives and lead to a persistent state change. Next slide, please. So together, these drivers of invasive species, climate change, and wildfire can lead to ecological transformations. This type of transformation is also sometimes called a state change, a regime shift, or a vegetation type conversion. And I'll use these kind of interchangeably today throughout this talk. But this is an AI-generated image of a forested system that transitioned to more of like a grassland type system. And it's easy to see just by looking at the, this image that with this state change, there can be large impacts on ecosystem structure, function, and services. And so one of the ecosystem services that I've studied quite a bit is carbon storage. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the global distribution of above ground biomass carbon, and you'll notice in this image that above ground biomass carbon tracks pretty closely with different vegetation types. So for example, forests store a lot more carbon than grasslands, and within forests, tropical forests store a lot more carbon above ground than temperate forests, for example. However, we know that carbon storage is not static, and it can change as the fluxes like productivity, respiration, and in the case of soils, decomposition can change. These fluxes and ultimately the carbon storage in the different pools, here we're talking about above ground biomass carbon, are ultimately influenced by the vegetation, the climate, and these disturbances. Next slide, please. So plant invasion, climate change, and wildfire can all change several carbon fluxes, including the productivity, the decomposition, leaching from the soils, as well as above and below ground allocation of carbon within plants, and ultimately the carbon storage in an ecosystem across these different pools of carbon storage. So after an event that causes tree mortality, something like a drought or wildfire, the biomass decays, or in the case of fire, the biomass is combusted, and the carbon is released back to the atmosphere. So plant invasion can also lead to, in some cases, an initial increase in above ground carbon storage as invasive plants fill in areas between existing native vegetation. It's very important to understand these changes in carbon storage, as this, like taking a step back here, feeds into the larger global carbon balance, and whether or not the land is acting as a sink or a source for carbon, thereby either amplifying or dampening global warming. Next slide. So in the cases of disturbance that lead to some kind of transformation from either forests or shrubs to grasses, above ground biomass can be greatly reduced. And actually, Toby had a great figure of this in his talk, showing like the sagebrush transition to cheatgrass, where you could visually see how the biomass was changing. There are a few papers that have studied how ecological transformations have changed above ground carbon storage. These are just a couple of them here. What we don't know, what still is kind of a research gap, is where the thresholds will be crossed with different disturbance intensities and combinations of disturbances that will then lead to a new state, where transformations will persist in the landscape. For example, like beyond a decade of the new transformed state, or where they will return to the pre-disturbance state, and ultimately what this means for above ground carbon storage. Next slide, please. So for this study, we have a few major research questions that we are exploring. First, where have ecological transformations occurred in the North Central region in recent decades? Second, how has carbon storage in forested systems changed due to ecological transformations? And third, which areas are at risk of future transformation? Next slide, please. In this study, we're using a combination of remote sensing analysis, data integration, literature review, and stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. We're studying forests across the North Central region, including these 7 states shown here. And these green areas in this figure are the tree dominant areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so to start this project, we hosted a workshop in the fall of 2023 with around 30 participants to really dive into the topic of ecological transformation. And so we discussed what constitutes ecological transformations, and we talked about what are some of the well-known examples of transformations. For one of the most common ones that people are familiar with is sagebrush to cheatgrass transition. Next slide, please. With the particular group of participants that we had at this workshop, we were able to dive into breakout groups and discuss the different systems that folks were working in, either researching or actively managing, and talk about how those areas may have changed over time, particularly after different disturbances. And so we used this opportunity to gather information about known transformations in the region from these participants. So the examples that they provided, including things like ponderosa pine forest being converted to annual invasive grasses following drought or wildfire, and mixed coniferous forests being converted to things like gamble oak and aspen forests after wildfire. Next slide. Okay, so we're using these areas of known transformations from that workshop to help inform our detection of ecological transformations across the whole region. So this part of the study is being led by Dr. Nayani Alangakun, and I'll refer any technical questions about the workflow shown here that you may have to her. But briefly, to kind of describe this workflow that we're going through, we're using different vegetation indices, things like NDVI or LAI, from MODIS and Landsat data. And we're using data from the recent decades from 2000 to 2024 in a breakpoint analysis, which then determines the thresholds of these ecosystem state changes or transformations. And then we take these thresholds and apply them pixel by pixel to identify areas that have undergone these state changes throughout the whole time series that we're looking across. And then we're going to pair this with invasive species occurrence data, as well as information on wildfire locations and other covariates like drought, for example, to identify the drivers of these transformations, as well as predict areas that might be vulnerable to future transformations. Next slide, please. Okay, so before jumping into the carbon portion, I thought I'd take a moment just to take a step back and talk about how carbon is measured for anyone who's not super familiar with this. But there are generally two different ways that you can measure carbon, either through field inventories or remotely sensed data. So the figure on the left may look familiar to some of you. This is from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, and it shows how the Forest Service sets up their plots when they're going to measure different characteristics of a forest stand. So within these plots, they measure all the trees over a certain diameter at breast height, and then use allometric equations to relate this diameter to some measure of biomass and convert that to carbon. So they have different protocols for shrubs and grasses that involve destructive harvest, where you actually go out and cut down all of that vegetation, biomass, and then you can directly calculate the carbon by drying and weighing that biomass and analyzing it in a lab to determine the percent carbon. Okay, all of that to say, we didn't do any of that. What we actually did was a remotely sensed method. So we're using satellite data to map vegetation and biomass across the whole region of the North Central U.S. So one method of active remote sensing is LiDAR, light detection and ranging, that creates a map of canopy heights, which can then be related with models to biomass and carbon storage of the vegetation across the larger landscape. Next slide, please. Okay, so for this project, we needed to assess the wall-to-wall carbon storage in this region and how that has changed through time. So for this, we needed to use several different satellite products, including LiDAR that I already mentioned and multispectral data, to develop a time series of biomass across the region. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, here's the workflow for that second part. If you're looking now in the blue box, again, you don't need to pay attention to all the details, but briefly, we're using Global Ecosystem Dynamics Investigation, or GEDI LiDAR data, for tree and shrub biomass, and rangeland analysis platform data for grass biomass, along with multispectral data from MODIS that goes back much further in time compared to GEDI, for example, to build a model with machine learning to create these annual estimates of above ground biomass across the region since the year 2000. And this will then allow us to go back and look at changes in carbon storage before and after these transformations. Next slide, please. Okay, I wanted to show some of the preliminary results that we have from these analyses. These are hot off the press, but we've been able to detect changes in vegetation cover since the year 2000, and we know which of these areas have coincided with fires. So in this figure, wildfires are shown in pink, in the little pink outlines, and there's a little inset there that you can see, and the different colors within that inset correspond to the year that the transformation occurred. So this only goes to 2014, and this is because we're trying to separate out the areas that we are considering stable, as in the transition has been stable. So in an area that transitioned in 2014, for example, we can look at the 10 years after that and see that it hasn't changed from the new transformed state to know that this is now a stable transformation. There are additional areas that have transformed more recently, but yet we don't have the information to know if these are going to be stable transformations or not. So what we know from this information so far is that between 7 and 8% of the total area of the North Central region experienced some kind of transformation. And now we're in the process of looking more at these transformations to understand where they coincided with wildfires. And the next step, I'll talk about next steps here in a minute, but the next step will be to bring in the grass invasion data. Okay, next slide, please.
Just a quick time check, Chelsea. We're at about 11:45.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'll wrap this up momentarily. Okay, this is a super quick case study. I wanted to show you an area within the Southern Rockies. This is part of Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And the thing that I wanted to point out here, if you look at that little bar graph, is we're looking at the coincidence of these transitioned areas with areas where fire also occurred. And so in this figure, the fire areas are in blue, not in pink. But so there was a lot of area that did coincide with a fire, as you see in the pink bar. But there's also a lot of area that did not coincide with a fire in this green bar here. And so now we're in the process of looking at, okay, what were the other things that maybe led to this transformation in that area? Next slide, please. Okay, this I just wanted to show 1 year of data. So this is 2017 biomass across the region. And you can see in general, above ground biomass tracks with the map of forest cover that I showed a little bit ago, where there's greater biomass in the forested areas on the western side of the region, and less biomass stored in the grasslands on the eastern side of the region. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we have these annual estimates of biomass, the next step will be to calculate the change in carbon storage associated with the transformation, looking just before and after the transformation occurred. Another next step that I mentioned is we have looked at where wildfire coincided with the transformations, but again, we're going to be pairing this with locations of plant invasions to understand which areas were impacted by plant invasion alone or in combination with fire. And finally, we'll also look for areas that are vulnerable to future transformation based on these different disturbances. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll have 3 main data products from this: a map of where the transformations have occurred, a map of the change in carbon storage associated with them, and then the last one will be this map of areas vulnerable to future transformations. Next slide, please. Okay, for the last phase of this project, we're working with land managers across the North Central region to co-develop a management menu for invasive grass species. And we're replicating a model from the U.S. Forest Service. So we're doing a literature review right now to look at some of the major strategies for dealing with invasive annual grasses. And then collectively, we'll come up with more detailed management approaches and tactics that folks could use in the region to address these different management challenges. The next slide shows an example of an existing management menu. And so we're going to definitely look through all of those that already exist on similar management menus. And then we'll again be jointly producing this with managers across the North Central region. Okay, next slide is my last slide. I wanted to end by giving one more plug for the North Central Risk, which is one of several regional risks across the U.S. and Canada. There are 2 new risks that have just started that are not reflected on this map here in the South Central and Southwest regions. And we host webinars like this one, as well as workshops and other events to bridge the gap between researcher and practitioner needs. And we're planning right now for our fall workshop to create this management menu that I talked about. So stay tuned for more details there. But please check out our website. We've got a lot of other ongoing projects and opportunities. And let us know if you'd like to get more involved and join the RISK team. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you to both of our speakers. I'm going to go ahead and allow participants to unmute now. And we have about 10 minutes for questions. And I think there were a couple in the chat, so I can take a look at those as well. If we want to start off, a question from Lewis Venture, question for Toby. Do we know the flux differences between pure non-native annual grasslands or forelands and pure perennial grasses? including native or introduced species such as crested wheatgrass and sagebrush, especially in the Great Basin.
Hey, yeah, and a more thought out response is available in text in the chat. But yeah, basically I was saying that our data set has some pretty good replication in these different communities. The ones that the data I was showing today is controlling for some of that plant community level variation, but it could also be isolated and analyzed independently. So we have some good data for different, crested wheatgrass and also native perennial grasslands and also rhizomatous perennial grasslands that could be kind of pulled apart. And then I was also pointing out that we have not looked at any forb-dominated areas, although have some data in invasive forb-dominated areas around Boise from rush skeleton weed. So yeah, and this is all flux in in this case, flux would be changed over time based on these restorations, but it's not full ecosystem fluxes. I also wanted to point out.
Thank you.
I guess I'll jump in if no one else has a question right off the bat. Chelsea, I'm curious, you said it about 8% of the North Central region that's experienced transformation? What has been the dominant type of transformation that you're seeing in your data set?
That's a good question. So we're looking at changes in forest cover to either grass or shrub. I don't have a breakdown of that. It was 7.7%. Of that 7.7%, how much has been forest to grass versus forest to shrub? I don't have that number yet. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting question. And we are also picking up some of these different transformations in forested types as well. So from the workshop that we got, that we were like gathering stakeholder information on where the transformations have occurred, they pointed out some of these examples that were like conifer forest to gamble oak or aspen forest or something like that. And so we might be able to pick that up in the because we're tracking these vegetation indices over time. We just need to dive into it a little bit more to know, I think. I don't have an answer in terms of breakdown for you, but it would be cool to see, yeah, what are the dominant transformations that we're seeing by those different categories. Yeah, that would be super cool.
Yeah, I have a question for Toby. This is Harry Quick with Enview. Toby, I didn't see anything about the impact of carbon related to time since restoration, because you mentioned at the beginning you had data 3 to, I think, 39 years after restoration. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so it's 3 to I think 30 or 29. Yeah, so the short answer is I haven't looked at it yet. And so for due diligence in this model that I was presenting today, I used that as a controlling variable so that time since restoration, that variation was essentially not going to affect our view of the results, but I do plan to go and look at that. And also, I'm going to try and work with the land managers and maybe some satellite data to figure out duration of invasion prior to restoration, and to see if we can kind of make some comparisons there too. Because so yeah, short answer is haven't looked into it yet, but definitely on the menu.
We have a raised hand from Maddie Case.
Hey, thanks
both of you for really interesting talks. I had a question for Toby about your reference sites, and I was curious how you approached choosing good matches for reference sites.
Painfully, there's a couple of the technicians who worked on this project here. Andrew Legue is on, and I almost want him to chime in because basically, yeah, it was a combination of working with land managers to, first of all, kind of query them and say, do you think these site types are even available in your area? And then a lot of hiking and going around and looking at taking some sort of preliminary plant community measurements to try and make sure that they were kind of matching a similar community type as the restored area. So matching plant community, matching aspect, matching soil type, and also, again, working with the managers to make sure that a reference community was something desirable, or that they kind of, their kind of dirt under their fingernails for take is like, this is kind of what we're going for with restoration to return it to something like this. So yeah, and sometimes those, of course, in the Great Basins, it's almost impossible sometimes to find a south-facing aspect reference community and then all the cheatgrass is on the south-facing aspects. And so one of the powerful things about the ability to do so much sampling is we're also using some just statistical tools to control for those differences so it wasn't perfect, but we tried really hard to go out there and work with folks to get those reference sites dialed in.
We had two more questions in the chat from Ashley Prentice. Thanks for the great presentations. In areas that transition from ponderosa to shrubland, Gamble oak, aspen, how much do you expect carbon storage to change in these types of transitions? Gamble oak and aspen can reproduce rapidly, leading to high carbon accrual initially, but curious what the long-term carbon impacts of these shifts may look like.
That's a great question. Yeah, so in some of these like forest to forest kind of transitions, I wouldn't necessarily expect that there would be all that much change in carbon storage over time. Just because the biomass, of different forest types is roughly kind of similar, more similar than a forest compared to a shrubland, or a forest compared to grassland, something like that. So I would expect that these changes are going to be a lot smaller than some of those other more drastic state changes that we might see. But that's a good point about the high productivity of these systems. Our work is just looking at the annual change in biomass, and so we wouldn't be able to pick up necessarily like changes in productivity or respiration or something like that. So yeah, that's my guess.
Hey, we had one more question in the chat, and then I think we'll end the formal presentation after that. So from Caitlin Meyernick, sorry if I mispronounced that. Thank you for your great talks and research, Chelsea and Toby. Toby, I'm wondering how you measured soil moisture and infiltration rates and how you plan to relate those data to the carbon observations. And do you have other measures of soil function that you plan to incorporate?
Thanks for the question. So we measured infiltration with mini disc infiltrometers in the field, and soil moisture we were measuring by as fast as we could, bagging them in freezer bags and bringing them back to the lab, drying them out as soon as we could, and just gravimetric water content lost. And so we are going to, I guess, do some pretty simple but robust regression analysis to try and see in those different, the restored, the invaded, and the never invaded communities, if we're able to detect some differences in those in infiltration and also water holding capacity of the soil, and just in a direct way by looking at the different community types, and then we'll see if that correlates to carbon. And because of the nature of the design, I think it gives us a pretty good causal effects model to work from. This was a relatively small $200,000 grant, so we don't have money to do more in-depth soil function research, but some other projects I'm looking at in similar restoration frameworks. For example, we're looking at microbial community function and outplanting success for restoration, demographic responses of natives, and how that relates to soil, nitrogen, water cycling, things like that. So definitely interested in that, but no time here.
Wonderful. Thank you. I guess one more big thank you to both of our speakers. I'm going to stop the recording now, but again, we'll stick around for an informal session for about 15 more minutes for folks that want to stay on and continue this discussion with our speakers.